person who's associated with quality and testing doing things that are not just writing tests and maintaining tests. So you can sit there and you can take a look at the architecture of something. You can take a look at redundancy. You can take a look at like, how do we, fail safe? There's reputational risk, for example, financial risk or something like that. And unless you are paid to worry about those things, those are things that I let people like the project managers worry about. AI is a trend toward the mean. And I think if you want to be exceptional, you can't be an AI, and you need to have human taste and insight to do that. The model that I like to use is Kempbeck's 3X model. So it's explore, expand, and extract are the 3 X's, because clearly the 3E model is not much fun. In my head, more popular than we thought it was.
Welcome to BrowserStack Talks, the podcast where we turn testing pain points into playbooks. I'm your host, David, and today we're honored by a true titan in the software testing world. He is the creator of WebDriver, the tool that has fundamentally changed the way we automate web browsers and in turn how we test the web itself. Welcome, Simon. Simon, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I am Simon Stewart. For a very long time, I was the lead of the Selenium project. I created WebDriver, and I was the co-editor with David on the W3C WebDriver Classic spec. I'm still involved with the WebDriver ByteEye stuff, although I have stepped down as the Selenium project lead. I am currently working as a software engineer at a company called Block, which you may know through Square or Cash App.
Brilliant. So, one of the key things that everyone knows you about, and I think that it would be a miss for me to not start there, is kind of like, where did the genesis of WebDriver and web testing, because you came after Jason Huggins, you saw what other people were doing, but what made you go, web testing's awful, I need to fix this, and then got to where we are now?
So there are two origin stories. The short one is, back when I started this, writing your own blogging software in Rails was incredibly trendy. So I thought I would teach myself how to write a blog in Rails. And like any good person who does test-driven development, I started with my web test first, realized there was no web testing framework, and started from there. That's the short one. The longer origin story is that I was working with ThoughtWorks at a client in Australia, and my colleague, Michael Collis, told me that the APIs we were using at the time, which was a library called HTTP unit, its APIs were terrible. And I went, no, these APIs are fine. And he went, why are they terrible? And he goes, well, they mix concerns. So there's like the browser and the element and the assertions and stuff like that. And it's all in just one massive API. And I went, that's fine. It doesn't really matter. And he's like, no. If this was object-oriented, it would be a lot better. And so to prove him wrong, I put an object-oriented facade over the top of HTTP unit. And much to my chagrin, he was right. It was a lot better. And over the course of a few projects, I sort of iterated on that, and I ended up with two interfaces, one called Web Element and one called Browser. And we sort of saw the value in the thing when HTTP unit was slowly becoming less and less capable, but there was a new library called HTML unit. So we added support for HTML unit, and I switched it out one night for the project I was working on. And my project team didn't realize for 3 or 4 days that we had changed the implementation. So it's like, good, this is a workable API. I then ended up on a project with a chap called Joe Warnes. And Joe is one of the most incredibly talented developers I've had the privilege of working with. And he'd been working on some similar ideas. He had a similar class to my web element called Element, and his replacement for Browser was a class called WebDriver. It's like, that is an amazing name. Can I nick it? And he's like, yeah, whatever. So we then had WebDriver and Web Element, which was the sort of first version of the API. And we worked on that project. And that was the first project where we found out about the concept, the importance of safety. So there are two forms of safety. there's actual safety and perceived safety. And as an engineer, when you're working on a project and you're using just something like HTML unit, you don't need to see the browser running. You trust that that thing is working. So your perceived safety matches the actual safety, which is high. However, when we would show it to the customer, the client, they would go, well, I can't see the browser running, and so I don't trust it. And so even though the actual safety was very high, the perceived safety was very low. So I sat down with a colleague of mine called Jim Arnold, and we took the WebDriver API and the Web Element API, and we backed it with Internet Explorer through COM. And it was incredibly slow and very painful. But what it allowed us to do was to run the same test that we had, but in a real browser. And for the first time, we saw the browser sort of flipping and going like click, 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 click. And it was pretty exciting. And so there was that. And then that project came to an end. And I had a chat with Paul Hammond, who was the sort of open source czar at ThoughtWorks, going like, this is ridiculous. I keep on going on a client site and I keep on writing these same kinds of APIs and wrappers over and over again. Is there some way of avoiding that? Now we could turn it into a product or we can open source it. And Paul, being Paul, goes like, open source it. And so we did. And that's how sort of we ended up with the initial version of WebDriver. There was another bit to that question, and I've gone off track completely. So
No, you definitely answered it, and so because this was about like the like I started with the genesis and how you got into web testing, right? And it's clear that you wanted to improve what you were working on, and you wanted to do it in the way that you felt comfortable, which I know for a fact is you always do everything TDD, right?
yeah.
It's funny. I like from my side. I never really saw the value of TDD until I started actually working on the Selenium project, and I got more into it. And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, no, this I need to do this for everything. It was always one of those things that I think kind of a lot of people don't see the value, and then they go, oh, it's just too hard, or it's just too kind of slow, or it's like, well, you're gonna have to write it at some point, and like you need to figure out what's correct and what's not, right?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? So people view TDD as a bit of a misnomer, right? Because people think it's test-driven development. And I think of it as differently. I think of it as test-driven design, right? So there is nothing, absolutely nothing in the world more boring than writing some code and then writing some tests after the fact. You're like, does it work? And the worst thing with those tests is you write them, they take a long time to write, they're tedious, and you don't know whether they work or not because you haven't written them with failing code, you've never seen them fail, so you just go, this is probably fine.
Yeah.
And you tend to overwrite them, so you tend to have far too many, and the granularity is wrong. Whereas when you're using TDD as a mechanism for exploring the API that you would like to use, so your test becomes a sort of first consumer of the API you want to write and use as a developer. Then what you do is you start probing like, well, this is how I want it to feel, and these are the kind of edge cases I care about. And the first thing that happens is you write fewer tests. But those tests are more important because they tell you sort of the boundary conditions and the expected happy path and the unhappy path and stuff like that. So you get like a far clearer sense of where you're doing it. And then because it's an iterative process, you write a test, it fails, you do a little bit of work, you write a test, it fails, you do a little bit of work. You end up in that sort of lovely iterative loop. And so writing a test becomes not a chore, but sort of a fun part of exploring the design of how you want the software to be.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm a huge fan of TDD done right. I'm not a huge fan of mindlessly writing tests.
So that reminds me of something, and it's something that I always attribute to you, because I'm showing my age now. I think it was Selenium Conference London 2016. You were doing the keynote, and one of my most favorite things that you said up there was, and I think it was then, you should only write one test, right? And you go from there. And I think that is a kind of a continuation of what you're saying, is that like, don't override your tests. I've gone on to kind of describe what you've said slightly differently to people, because I also use it as a way of doing risk analysis, because then suddenly people think of the risk, write that one test to get rid of that risk only, and then move to your next risk and so on like that. Because I've seen horrors of people doing things with Selenium, like, how do I test my database? I remember that one. It was so hard. Like, when you've been collaborating, you've been a consultant, how do you get people to always think about, like, from TDD to that one test to things like that? What is the way that you guide people through that process?
Sure. So it took me a long time to sort of figure out a nice way of explaining this. And it was only when I was working with Sally Goebel, who is fantastic, by the way, that we sort of sat down and went like, why do we test at all? And like, we don't test for pleasure. I mean, we might really enjoy it, but sort of, we're not paid to test for pleasure, right? We're paid to test for a reason.
Yeah.
And the concept that we came up with was around that we do testing to mitigate technical risk. So every line of code you write represents risk. Like, we know that no software is bug-free. Like, I've seen people put bugs into Hello World, either with punctuation or something like that, right? It is easy to do. No software is bug-free. However, what we can do is we can go like, even though we know this isn't safe, we are confident that we have identified the major risk areas, that we are fairly sure the things that we've written new are going to work, and the things that were there before are continuing to function, and then we can release it. And so it becomes quite interesting, right? When people go like, I need to write this test, and you go, how is that, like, which bit of risk is that test addressing? Like, what are we concerned about? And that allows you to approach conversations from a very different way. It also allows you to be a person who's associated with quality and testing, doing things that are not just writing tests and maintaining tests. You can sit there and you can take a look at the architecture of something. You can take a look at redundancy. You can take a look at, like, how do we, fail safe? Do we fail safe? Do we fail open? Do we fail closed? All of those fun things. And it widens the scope of what you're doing, and it widens the remit of what you do. But the key guiding light is like, how are we managing technical risk? Now, we call it technical risk because there are like loads of other risks with a project. Like, there's reputational risk, for example, or financial risk or something like that. And unless you are paid to worry about those things, those are things that I let people like the project managers worry about, or the engineering managers worry about. But technical risk is definitely something that, as a tester, I'm really concerned about. And so that's the sort of main focus and driving force behind the conversations I have right now.
Brilliant. And so, like, one of the things that kind of, as you've been kind of working on WebDriver and things like that, is that you've seen the project scale up in kind of testing code, things like that. I think I saw someone posting the other day. They asked AI how much effort would it take, how much effort and cost would it take to build something like Selenium, and it was like tens of millions of dollars of human effort went into it. And I can see it, I can believe it, right? So we've got like browser vendors who support the project and work with the project. You've got all the contributors. Like, when it comes to scaling up your tests, things like that, obviously you've got to start from somewhere, but where is that somewhere for you? Like, when you're trying to scale up, like, you see things are being successful, now you need to scale it up. Where do you normally start, from a technical point of view?
Do you mean scaling a project or scaling the number of tests on a project?
Scaling a project and scaling the number of tests, right? Because, like, to me, tests are your design, as you said, right? And so your tests lead to scaling up your project in one way or another, right? Just by lines of code, you're scaling it up.
Sure. So there's a couple of things. The thing that I really like to do is, for a while I used to do defect-driven development, which is where you tell people the project is complete and then you wait for the bug reports to roll in, and then that helps you prioritize like what you need to work on next. And it was always relatively jocular. Like, we never really did it, although it was incredibly tempting. But what that encourages you to do is it allows you to think about, like, what's the smallest piece of functionality I can add to this existing code that enables a new feature or capability. And so that's what you do on a project that's relatively mature. The model that I like to use is Kemp Beck's 3X model. So it's explore, expand, and extract are the 3 X's, because clearly the 3E model is not much fun. So the explore is like, I keep on saying the word like, I do apologize.
That's okay.
The explore phase is very much where you're trying things out. So it's cheap and cheerful. You may not be writing tests, just hacking code. You're figuring out like the direction you want to be moving in. The second phase, the expand phase, is where you have hit upon an idea that's really good, and then you start refining it and making it better. This is a point where you put in tests. You probably throw away the prototype. You start writing tests, you start thinking about TDD, and that allows you to start sort of getting more and more value out of it. And then finally, you reach that sort of top of the S-curve where the product is mature, there are many of the features it needs, and what you're doing right now is you're extracting the most value that you can out of that software. And so you are no longer sort of actively adding so much stuff to it, and instead you're finding the edges and the rough edges and the bug fixes that need to be done. And that's a really nice way of thinking about the life cycle of something. The twist on that I think Kent talks about as well is that in a single product, you can go through the 3X lifecycle many, many times. So as an example from Selenium, we had the development of the remote wire protocol, and then we worked on that, and when we went, hang on a second, there's a better way of doing this, and we did the W3C WebDriver protocol, and now we're doing another 3X approach when it comes to the implementation of WebDriver BiDi. So Selenium itself is a mature product, but within that you can see these 3 phases where we've gone through and we've gone, this is the thing we want to be able to do, we've experimented, we've started figuring out how to do it, and now, certainly for BiDi, we're in the expand phase of figuring out how to do that. So that's a really nice way of scaling a project.
No, and I think that's like quite important for people to think about, because like everyone's always worried about how to think bigger, right, when it comes to the projects they're working on, which is why I want to raise it. And like, I think you've been fairly successful in the projects that you've got to work on over your career. And like, as you said, like you've done this a few times, and now within the Selenium project at least, and you kind of like, every time you've done it, you always seem to pull other people into it, right? So kind of, we've been expanding, we've managed to do like W3C things where we kind of like got those people involved. And like, I think it's important for kind of everything, right? Like when it comes to open source and standardization, because like then it's just easier for everyone. And eventually at the end of the day, I think it was Brendan I said this, right? Open always trumps closed. Standardized always trumps unstandardized at the end of the day. It just takes a little bit longer, but it always wins, right? So kind of like, what was, obviously because I know the story, but I'm trying to get it for other people. Like, what was the process and kind of the pain points that you gave across to kind of browser vendors to go, hey, this is actually really critical? Like, what was the kind of reasons for doing
that? For standardizing WebDriver itself?
Yeah.
Thereby hangs a tale. So a long, long time ago, I was working at Google, and my team looked after the APIs that people use for doing browser automation. And we boiled it down to 2. And the first one was Selenium, or Selenium 2 as it was, WebDriver. And the second one was a JavaScript-based framework from which the atoms were extracted. So within the sort of heart of Selenium, for people who don't know, there's a JavaScript library called the Selenium atoms. And they allow you to do sort of the fundamental building blocks of browser automation. And we use them cross-platform and cross-browser. Or we did. So we had these, and we were working with Firefox and running all our tests in Chrome, and we got that up and running. Maybe Chrome didn't exist. We definitely were using it with Firefox. That was what we were doing. And then Opera Software at the time were trying to figure out ways of increasing their compatibility with the software that was coming out on the web, and Google were writing a lot of it. And they came to Google and went like, could you start running a test on Opera? And it's like, we would love to run our test on Opera because it's a fantastic browser. Like at the time it was standards compliant, it was super fast, it was a really nice bit of kit. But I don't know if you've found this in your experience, but getting software engineers to write tests is incredibly hard work. Like they just don't like doing it.
Always.
And so we'd persuaded them to start writing tests against the WebDriver APIs. And that allowed them to sort of test with Internet Explorer and Firefox, and it was like everything was good. We couldn't ask them to then write the test for Opera with a different set of APIs. Like either there'd have been a handful of tests that would have been done, which wouldn't have given them coverage, or they wouldn't have written tests at all. And so the thing that we were talking about was like, well, if we can plug it into our build infrastructure, absolutely we will do it. At the same time, Andreas Tolfsen, who was at Opera, had been working on a browser automation API, I think. And so he adapted that, which is their sort of, it was Dragonfly, I think was their debugging protocol.
Yeah, it was.
So he used Dragonfly to control Opera with a sort of completely proprietary thing, but there was a little shim that you put in the driver that you would use, and he got that to speak the WebDriver protocol. And then suddenly we were able to automate Opera. And it was maybe Selenium Conf in 2012, like the first one in San Francisco, that he sort of came up to us and he was like, have you thought about maybe taking this to the W3C? Because clearly it's something where there's a need for it. Clearly it's something that multiple browsers need. And it is crazy that it's proprietary. And I'll be honest with you, it had never occurred to me to do that. Because in my head, Selenium or WebDriver was this sort of little testing API that we used to do. Like everyone in the community knew everyone else. It was relatively small back then. Although sufficiently large that you could have a conference about it. So maybe, like, I'm a bit slow sometimes. Like maybe it should have occurred to me that it was more popular than we thought it was. And thanks to Andreas poking and Opera Software support, that's why we started down the road to the W3C. And then both Mozilla and Google were enormously supportive of that effort. And then eventually Microsoft and Apple joined in the fun. And we sort of accidentally stumbled into a browser automation standard. I don't think that was our goal when we started it, but the obvious appealing thing is that the minute someone said, could you do this? It's like, oh yeah, that would be great. And the reason why it'd be great is because writing browser automation APIs is incredibly difficult and time consuming. Like the way that the WebDriver API works is buried deep in the bowels of the browser. It hooks into all the internals. And for the open source browsers, that's feasible. It's not easy, but it's feasible. You can do it. But for the proprietary browsers, it's not an option. And the people who are best placed to be able to automate a browser are the people who are working on that browser itself. And they can put in the hooks they need in order to enable the facilities you need in order to do the automation more easily. And so the other benefit of moving to the W3C is that now the browser vendors, the people who are best placed to make changes to the browser to support testability, were involved in designing the protocol that we would use to do the browser automation. And to this day, like there's no way we could do WebDriver by day if the browser vendors weren't involved. It would just be prohibitively painful and expensive.
Yeah, definitely. It's become such a big thing now that like there's a platform for kind of everyone watching called Web Platform Tests. It's just a repository of major tests out there that is maintained by Google, Microsoft, Mozilla, Apple, Igalia, Baku, like all these
Samsung.
like big companies, Samsung, kind of probably if they have any skin in the game when it comes to browsers, they are likely to be working on that repository, and it's about testing it constantly. So, like with web platform tests, we've got WebDriver, and it's now kind of with all of these things, WebDriver is an incredible key piece of infrastructure for the web, right? I don't think anyone's going to dispute that. When it comes to open source, firstly, did you think it would be this wildly successful? And secondly, like how did you maintain all of it in such a way that you kind of are still sane today?
No, no one starts an open source project thinking it's going to be adopted by people and there'll be conferences about it. And like, it just blows my mind that's happened. I think, how did we stay sane? I think the first thing that we did is we were very clear about what we were doing and what we weren't doing. And that has been detrimental in some ways to the success of the project. Like, we should have done Selenium Manager a million years ago, and we didn't. And there are other things like that. We should have made it a bit more batteries included, but we didn't because we were focused on the browser automation stuff. Like Steve Jobs used to say, it's 1,000 no's to every yes, right? You've got to stay focused on the thing it is that you're trying to solve, and then you can work on that. I think the other thing is that the development community of Selenium feels relatively small. If you go onto our Slack channels, if you go into what used to be the main list of the IRC channel, like, there's a handful of people who are regulars that you will talk to. The core development team of Selenium never grew above like 10 people at its biggest, and it sort of fluctuates between 5 and 7 people normally. It's not a big team, and we've known each other for years. And so a lot of the time it just feels like you're developing software with your friends. And that's a really, really nice place to be. I think also the Selenium community as a whole is welcoming and friendly and nice. And like, it's such a pleasant place to be that when you're there and you're just writing the software, it's like, oh, I'm genuinely enjoying this. I'm solving a problem. It's been fantastic. I should also be honest. I should also say that we were incredibly fortunate to be supported by, the companies we worked for, Google, Mozilla in your case, Opera Software, into Microsoft with the John Chanson and stuff like that. It was crucial to have that kind of backing to be able to give the team the focus that they needed in order to work on the software the way they did. I honestly think without that kind of implicit commercial backing, it would have been really hard to continue developing the project the way it did. But I think we worked really hard to get it to a point where it became useful for the companies to invest in that way. And so, like, it's hard to know where that began, but it certainly, over the sort of key stages of the project, that was vital for us to be able to do the things we did. I don't know. What was your perception of that, by the way?
Well, the thing is that, like, I knew there were a lot of things that you were doing behind the scenes with, like, the Software Freedom Conservancy. I was never part of those meetings. I kind of was always focused on getting WebDriver into Firefox, and maintaining kind of my little patch of the open source project. And kind of that took up all my time. And I knew you were kind of like doing something similar, plus the actual leadership stuff, right? Like, where's the budget? Like, who's paying for the conference this year? Things like that. That was always the thing that kind of I was thankful someone was doing, and it was always magically done, right? And I think I think that is kind of one of the key things, that there was never like, oh, I'm doing this by myself. It was always something you kind of just did for us, right? Like, that was the like, and I say us, like all the developers, the PLC was always 5 members, but again, it's like, it fluctuated. You could see it coming and going. Not everyone was at every meeting, things like that. And, we survived countless copyright attacks, patent attacks, things like that. And like you only ever heard of it like, 6 months later because like, oh, we're in the pub, we're talking. It's like, oh, did I tell you about this? No.
I mean, we were incredibly fortunate. Like the conferences, Source Labs and Appler Tools, White October events, the people who helped us organize them did so much of the heavy lifting. And without them, I don't think we would have had those conferences. The pattern thing, I do remember I joined Facebook as it was then, and I got in touch with the lawyers there. And then about sort of 3 months, 6 months after I joined, some patent troll came after us. And I remember having a sort of quite pleasant evening chatting with the legal counsel at Facebook, going like, how do we do this? And we dug up some prior art and they dealt with it. So that was phenomenal. The SFC have done an awful lot for the project as well. They sort of provided the funding, the accountancy, the legal framework, and all the sort of ancillary bits of the project that, like you say, we don't really want to do ourselves, but are so essential for a successful project. And just being able to sort of partner with them and know that we don't need to worry about any kind of stuff, to do with the actual running of the project or the legal risk or anything like that, just allowed us to focus on the stuff we wanted to do. I don't know if I did that much myself. I always felt like I was having fun and chatting with people, and then I was incredibly fortunate to be surrounded by the Selenium community and the companies we partnered with and the SFC, who were doing so much of the heavy lifting.
Yeah. Which then leads me on to, what do you think is the biggest misconception people have about open source projects, or the kind of the role of the maintainers inside these open source projects?
It's a good question. I think there's a couple of them. The first one is people feel like they can't or they shouldn't contribute. So yeah, of course you should. Like the mantra with open source is to scratch your own itch. Like, here is something that you need to do. So if you find a bug in an open source project and you have the skills to fix it, you can fix it. That's fine. And if you take a look at the contributions to almost any open source project, you'll find there's a sort of spike of regular contributors and then an incredibly long tail of people who have like 1 or 2 or 3 commits. Like, it's not very many. So you can dip in and dip out. Like, you can donate some code and it doesn't mean that you're going to be there forever. On the other hand, because so many contributors to an open source project dip in and then leave and they're never there forever, but the code remains, the open source maintainers can find it hard to say yes to particular PRs that come in. So even if it's really important for you, I think most open source maintainers understand that you've contributed, you've gone through the hoops, you've done all the work because it is important to you. But sometimes you have to be able to say no to that, because for the long-term health and longevity of the project, just every line of code you have to maintain is something that needs to be kept. I mean, in our case, the better part of 20 years, right?
Yeah.
And so you have to be quite careful about that. And so there's a trade-off. So first of all, do contribute. And second of all, if someone says no, it's almost definitely not personal, and it's something to do with either a lack of capacity. Like if it takes a long time for your PR to be reviewed, it isn't because people are ignoring you. It's because they just don't have time and they haven't got an opportunity to get around to it. And if someone says no, it isn't because they don't like the feature and they don't like the thing you've tried to do. It's because they're thinking that in the long run, it's going to be more expensive to maintain this thing than it is to not have it in the repo. Which can bruise your ego, but it's very, very seldom personal. Like I've never done anything personal like that.
No.
And I can't think of another open source maintainer that has. But I have been careless about reviews and how prompt I've been with those.
Yeah. No, I can agree with that. I've never deliberately said no. I've always thought, like, if I add this, what is the risk by adding this code? And then from there, kind of go through my head. Sometimes it's like, yeah, like look at it, it's like, oh, cool, they fixed the documentation, automatically go in, right? Like, I'm lazy. I don't want to write documentation. I do, but like, I don't want to. And I think it's like important to be able to handle that. Amazing. So we've come to kind of near the end. There's one question I want to ask you before we head into our quick fire round.
Sure.
Everyone is now kind of knows you as the person who's defined dopamine driven development. Um, what is it? And why have you used that term? Because I think I've spoken to people about, and I call it something different, so I'm not going to call it here, but like, um, why do you, what is it to you? And like, how do you encourage people to kind of not do it?
Um, so software development. Okay, so dopamine is the chemical that's released in your brain as a reward. It's important to know it's just neurochemistry. Like you can't become addicted to something your own body generates. So you can't become addicted to dopamine, but it does feel good. And so the idea with dopamine-driven development is rather than doing large chunks of work, which you don't get rewarded for very often, you do a small piece of work and you get a little hit of dopamine. You do another little piece of work, you get another little hit of dopamine. And it becomes significantly easier and more pleasant to write software when you're being rewarded constantly for the stuff you do, rather than sort of when you get like a big piece of work done and then you get a big hit of it. It's like the difference between scrolling on TikTok and reading a newspaper article. They probably both release the same amount of dopamine if it's something you really enjoy reading. But when you're scrolling on TikTok, the feedback is so much faster and it feels a lot more rewarding to be able to do that. So when it comes to software development, try and do little pieces and land them, and little pieces and land them. And you can see that in the Selenium project because we do trunk-based development. And so even the biggest changes, we tend to land on trunk and we tend to grow it organically. So during the Selenium 4 process, before we released Selenium 4, we rewrote the whole of the Selenium server. And if you had been watching the repo, you would have seen the new Selenium server growing in new packages that were in trunk. And at any time you could try it out and you could have explored with it. And it was only right at the end of the day that we suddenly started switching it and starting to make it available to people. But that process of sort of slowly building it up and doing a little bit is the key to dopamine-driven development. How do you define it?
So, to me, there's the good bit of dopamine-driven development, which is what you've just described. There's also the kind of the bad dopamine-driven development, or kind of I call it the resume-driven development, where people they kind of get the dopamine from going, oh look, I can do all this shiny stuff, and I've been a big advocate for when developing software to develop boring software, because boring means it's easy to maintain.
Yeah. Have you read the Choose Boring Technology paper?
I haven't.
Oh, it's so good. I can't remember who wrote it, Dan someone or another, but it's fantastic. And he's got the idea of technology tokens. And you can spend it on some new whiz-bang technology, but then you have to do everything else in a very limited way. Or you choose boring technology and then you spare more of your innovation tokens to do fun things. It's a bit like spoon theory for people who are trying to manage their mental energy and load. Yes, the thing you call bad dopamine-driven development, I call fashion-driven development. It's like, I'm going to do the trendy thing. And it's like, great. Is that the best thing to do? I don't know, but it's fancy and it looks good on my CV.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I find there's now a stereotype for front-end developers who kind of like, oh, if you're a front-end developer, that is the only way you develop now. And it's come from, I think, kind of the way JavaScript libraries have built up over time, and kind of people get an itch and they need to scratch it themselves and then go, oh, look, I've got my new framework and I've put it into my work. Look how great it is. It's like, okay, cool. Boring software is good.
We might be saved from a lot of that by the rise of LLMs and AI.
Yeah.
Like the corpus of training data tends to lead people doing doing web stuff to React and TypeScript. And so, like, maybe we'll see fewer libraries being written and more people sort of following these patterns that have already been established in the industry. It'll be fun to see.
Yeah. Right. We're on to the final round of questions. In this round, and it's because I'm a waffler, the round is a quick fire round to stop me waffling. And like, so the idea is you give a very concise answer. I do reserve the right, if you say something really interesting, just to kind of ask a follow-up to it. But again, it will be concise. Are you ready?
Yeah, sure. Let's do this.
Favorite testing tool you didn't create?
Oh, JUnit.
Nice. Most underrated skill for web testers today?
Being able to talk to people.
That's a common answer. I think it's important. What is the testing best practice that you think is overhyped?
I would say exhaustively testing everything rather than trying to identify the minimum subset of stuff that you need in order to prove the product is good.
Book or resource every aspiring tester or developer should read?
Other than Choose Boring Technology, no. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, really, just so that you then know, first of all, where your towel is, and second of all, not to panic.
Lovely. If you weren't in tech, what do you think you'd be doing now?
I loved it. I had an option. My first job was a radio broadcast engineer, and I loved that. That was a huge amount of fun. So maybe I'd be back in radio. I also used to like writing, so maybe I'd be writing something.
Perfect. And final question, because like you mentioned, LLMs are changing things. Why do you think humans are still needed in the age of AI, especially in testing?
AI is a trend toward the mean, and I think if you want to be exceptional, you can't be an AI, and you need to have human taste and insight to do that. That was a brief answer.
No, it's a great answer. So a few episodes ago, I had Dan, who's one of my colleagues, on talking about things, and he described AI as the great averager. It either averages you up if you know nothing, and if you use it blindly, it will average you down. But if you add the humanity into it, humanity can average itself up. So it all depends on how you use it, but you still need that humanity. I like to describe it as well as kind of AI is a force multiplier. If you don't understand the underlying craft, you're force multiplying zero. You're not getting anywhere really, because you won't know what it's done, or understand it, or how to fix it.
Yeah.
So, Simon, this has been an incredible conversation. Thank you for sharing your journey, your stories, your insights. You've definitely left an indelible mark on our industry, and I'm thankful. And I say this as kind of as someone as your friend and someone who's worked with you and things like that for like 20 years. Is there anything you want to add? Is there anywhere where people can see what you're doing, how you're doing it, things like that?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me on here. It's been a real pleasure to talk, as it always is. Things that I'm doing, I mean, I've got my blog at rocketpoweredjetpants.com, which I update infrequently, but it is there. And keep an eye on the Selenium project and the WebDriver BiDi spec, because good things are coming.
Brilliant. Thank you. To our listeners, please can you make sure to subscribe or follow, depending on what platform you've listening to us or watching us on. Make sure you can get the next episode. This has been fantastic, Simon. Thank you for your time today. Thank you all for tuning in.
Thank you, everyone.